June 14th, 1982, Bay County, Florida. Within minutes, 24-year-old Janet Renee White was dragged from her office, stabbed repeatedly, and left with more than 30 injuries. Her attacker, delivery driver Kayle Barrington Bates, was caught at the scene, her blood on his clothes, her ring in his pocket. Now, 43 years later, after failed appeals, his execution is set for August 19, 2025. On the surface, Kayle Barrington Bates looked like an ordinary young man. Born in 1958, raised in West Palm Beach, he was polite, disciplined, even serving in the Florida National Guard. To family, he was someone who asked about their lives, someone who seemed to care. But appearances can hide a dangerous truth. His victim, Janet Renee White, was just 24, full of life, love, and dreams. She managed a small insurance office, studied at night to build a brighter future, and planned to start a family with her husband, Randy. By all accounts, she was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. And yet, on that June afternoon, her path crossed with Bates's. There was no history between them, no feud, no motive that could ever explain what happened next. He didn't know her. He simply chose her. What drove him was not jealousy, not desperation, but something far darker. An urge to dominate, to control, to take what was never his. The contrast was chilling. A man who could act gentle at home, but transform into a predator when faced with opportunity. This wasn't about survival. This was about power and possession. June 14th, 1982. What began as a normal Monday afternoon for Janet Renee White ended in unspeakable horror. At just 24, she had every reason to be hopeful. A devoted husband, a growing career, dreams of children, and her own insurance office one day. That day, she shared lunch at home with her husband, Randy. He insisted on following her back to work, watching as she unlocked the door and waved him goodbye. At 12:55 p.m., he kissed her for the last time. By 1:07, she was gone. Unbeknownst to Janet, Kayle Barrington Bates had already broken into the back of the State Farm office. He waited in silence until she returned. When she answered the ringing phone, he struck. Witnesses later recalled screams so chilling it echoed beyond the office walls. Then nothing. Bates cut the phone cord, shutting down her only link to the outside world. What followed was a brutal struggle. Court records reveal that Janet fought desperately, scratching, resisting, refusing to surrender. But Bates overpowered her, dragging her from the office into the woods just steps away. There, the attack escalated. She was beaten, strangled, and stabbed twice in the chest. The autopsy recorded over 30 injuries across her face and body, clear evidence of resistance against a man who had no intention of letting her live. Bates's actions were not impulsive, they were calculated. He lay in wait, ambushed her, and once she resisted, his need for control exploded into lethal rage. Prosecutors said he attempted sexual assault. Even his own admissions confirmed one-sided sexual conduct, with both his and Janet's clothing carrying traces of semen. To him, Janet was not a person. She was an object to dominate. And when it was over, Bates didn't flee in panic. He lingered, attempting a clumsy escape, only to walk straight into the path of armed officers arriving at the scene. His clothes were stained with Janet's blood. In his pocket was her diamond wedding ring, a final, haunting symbol of his attempt to strip her of dignity, even in death. Psychologists studying this case point to a chilling psychological shift. What began as an act of lust quickly transformed into something far darker, an obsession with power and possession. Janet's resistance became the trigger for his fury. The more she fought back, the more determined he was to crush her completely. The brutality of his attack speaks not of a man overcome by passion, but of a predator desperate to assert control at any cost. For Randy White, her husband, the events of that afternoon were shattering. Minutes after leaving her side, he was called back to the office. There, a sheriff's chaplain delivered the words that would haunt him forever. "Your wife has been murdered." Kayle Barrington Bates didn't get far. Minutes after the attack, he stumbled out of the woods and walked straight into armed officers rushing to the scene. He was covered in Janet's blood, and in his pocket, police found her diamond ring. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no escape. In March 1983, a jury convicted him of kidnapping, attempted sexual battery, armed robbery, and first-degree murder. 11 out of 12 jurors voted for death. Judge Fred Turner made it official. But even as the verdict was read, Bates showed little emotion, cold, detached, as if the brutality of his actions still hadn't reached him. The legal battle did not end there. In 1985, and again in 1995, he was resentenced. Both times the outcome was the same: death. Each time, prosecutors laid out the horrific evidence, and each time, Bates clung to technicalities, insisting he had been misunderstood, that jurors were biased, that the system was flawed. For more than 4 decades, his attorneys filed motion after motion: DNA testing, claims of organic brain damage, arguments that jurors were misled to think he might be freed in only 12 years, if not sentenced to death. Even suggestions that one juror had family ties to the victim. But courts at every level rejected him. The evidence was simply too strong, and the passage of time too great. Psychologists see a clear pattern. Bates was not driven by remorse, but by fear of death. His appeals were less about proving innocence, and more about survival, stalling, delaying, reaching for any thread of hope. He seemed incapable of confronting the reality of what he had done. The same need for control that fueled his crime now drove his fight against the inevitable. And in July 2025, the fight ended. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant, setting Bates's execution for 6 p.m., August 19, 2025, at Florida State Prison. After 43 years on death row, after countless appeals and second chances, the sentence of the court is finally set to be carried out. August 19, 2025, at Florida State Prison in Stark, the final chapter of one of the state's most haunting crimes unfolded. Kayle Barrington Bates, now 67 years old, was led into the death chamber under a warrant signed by Governor Ron DeSantis. At exactly 6 p.m., the curtain rose. Bates was already strapped to a gurney, his left arm extended, the 4-line in place. When asked if he had any final words, he gave only a flat response. No, he had refused even his last meal. At 6:01, the drugs began to flow. Witnesses described his breathing quickening, then slowing. By 6:05, he was unresponsive. 12 minutes after the process began, at 6:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. The chamber itself was cold and quiet. No spectacle, no resistance, just the silent efficiency of a state carrying out its sentence. And outside that room, history was being made. This was Florida's 10th execution of the year, the highest number since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, cementing the state's place at the top of the nation's execution record in 2025. But for the family of Janet Renee White, this was not about statistics. Among the witnesses sat Randy White, the husband who had kissed Janet goodbye only minutes before her murder in 1982. He had waited 43 years for this moment. As the curtain lowered and the chamber fell silent once more, the long fight in the courts was finally over. For Randy White, watching Kayle Barrington Bates take his final breath was not a moment of triumph, but of release. 43 years earlier, Randy had kissed his wife Janet goodbye outside her office. Minutes later, she was gone. Since then, he has lived with the weight of that day, waiting for the justice promised to him in 1983. After the execution, Randy spoke with quiet resolve. "It's overdue," he said. "You've got to find a shorter route than 43 years. There has to be a better system that will see all these appeals through quicker." His words were not angry. They were weary, reflecting a lifetime of waiting, of reliving the same nightmare through every appeal and delay. He also expressed deep gratitude. In a public statement, Randy thanked Governor DeSantis for signing the death warrant, and he praised law enforcement and prosecutors who had stood by the case for decades. "I am truly humbled by the outpouring of love and support from so many who didn't know either one of us. I thank you from my heart. It means more than you will ever know." Yet even as justice was carried out, grief lingered. Randy admitted he had long feared that either Bates would die before his sentence was carried out, or that he himself would not live to see this day. The execution, he said, closed one chapter, but it could never erase the pain of losing Janet, or the life they might have built together. For Janet's family, the execution marked the end of a legal battle, but not the end of sorrow. Justice had been delivered, but the loss remained permanent. And for Randy White, the man who still calls Janet the love of his life, closure will never mean forgetting. For over 40 years, the name Kayle Barrington Bates haunted Florida's courts. His crime was brutal, his guilt clear, yet it took decades for justice to reach its end. But does an execution ever truly bring closure? For Janet Renee White's family, those years meant reliving the nightmare again and again. For Bates, it meant delaying the inevitable, not with remorse, but with fear. The truth is harsh. Justice in such cases is never simple. It cannot erase grief or restore what was lost. At best, it is a reckoning, a final step in a tragedy that began in minutes and lasted a lifetime. As we close, may we remember Janet not for the horror of her death, but for the life she lived and the lessons her story leaves behind. Thank you for watching. Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories that shine a light on crime, justice, and humanity.